Hello class, welcome to the Module 3 and Module 4 of our Biochemistry for Medical Laboratory Science. For today's lecture, we will be discussing the structures of the major compounds of the body, amino acids, proteins, and your enzymes. But before we head on to our main discussion, let me just give you a few reminders. This will be a two-part lecture video. The first part, we will be discussing the structures of the major compounds of the body and amino acids. And for the second part, it will be about the proteins and your enzymes. So please do your advanced reading. Use your notes, module handouts, and your reference books. Number 3, take down important keynotes. And lastly, sit back and relax. So like what we've mentioned on our orientation day, biochemistry is a preparatory subject towards your more professional subjects. So, ina-expect talaga natin na information overload siya. So, importante na mag-take down notes po tayo ng mga i-mention ni Ma'am Trina later on and mag-advance reading po tayo. Okay po? So, carbon is the central element. All your biomolecules or all your major biomolecules contain your carbon chain or ring. So kung mapapansin nyo, yung structural formula ng ating mga biomolecules, major biomolecules, meron po silang carbon chain or carbon ring. Your carbon has 4 outer shell electrons and has 4 valence. Therefore, its bonding capacity is great. It forms covalent bonds. Please do not forget. Hence, it has strong bonds. Once your carbon is bound to other elements or to other carbons, it is very stable. So sabi nga po nila, si DNA ang isa sa mga overrated or siya talaga yung overrated na molecules. Okay, sa ating namang periodic table, si carbon naman yung pinaka-overrated na element or your atom. And then your carbon binds to more than just your hydrogen. It can also bind to OH groups in your sugars, to NH2 groups in amino acids, to H2PO4 groups of your nucleotides of DNA, RNA, and ATP. And then ano po bang tawag dito sa tatlong to? Ang tawag sa kanila ay mga functional groups. Hence, the table on your screen. Ito yung mga examples ng mga functional groups natin, structural formula, examples, and saan ba sila mostly nahahanap. Number 1 is your hydroxyl group. Pakitandaan, si hydroxyl group, meron silang OH sa kanilang structural formula. Okay, tignan natin yung example, yung mga naka-green na highlight, si ethanol, it contains a hydroxyl group. And then it can be found mostly yung mga OH natin or yung mga hydroxyl group in your carbohydrates, your proteins, your nucleic acids, and your lipids. So basically, they can be found on all of your biomolecules. Next are your carbonyl group. It can be found mostly on your carbohydrates and then your nucleic acids. Next are your carboxyl group, yung mga COOH natin. They can be mostly found on your proteins and lipids as well. Next, your amino groups, yung mga NH2, NH3, di ba? They can be found on your proteins and then your nucleic acids. Next, your sulfhydryl. They can be found on your proteins and your phosphate groups. Saan ba sila madalas nakikita? Sa nucleic acids po natin. And lastly, your methyl group na usually nakikita sa mga alanine. Alanine is a type of your amino acid that can be found on your proteins. For the major biomolecule structural formula that we will be discussing for today's lecture, unahin na natin si carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, it hydrates of the carbon CH2O. And then when we say carbohydrates, it basically means saccharide. And then your saccharide means sugar. So itong tatlong terms na to, they are all synonymous to one another. Carbohydrates, saccharide, sugar. Next, the most abundant carbohydrates are your polysaccharides. Please do not forget. And then the most important carbohydrate in the body is your glucose. And then the chemical composition of your carbohydrates, it basically contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then yung ratio niya sa ating katawan or yung ratio ni carbon, hydrogen, oxygen onto your carbohydrates, 1:2:1. Please do not forget. And these are the more terms to remember. Pakitandaan lang po muna sila. We will be discussing that later on. Okay? And then these are the major functions of your carbohydrates. Number one, it is used or primarily used as an energy. Okay? For the fuel of the biological functions happening inside of our body. So it is the conversion. When we convert your glucose or your sugar, it will be then converted into ATP. Okay, your adenosine triphosphate, and then your carbohydrates, it can be stored in the form of your glycogen. Next, your carbohydrates, it can serve as a structural element for the cell wall of the bacteria, for your peptidoglycan, your fungi, your plants, as cellulose and animals, and exoskeleton of your insects in the form of chitin. Next function of your carbohydrates, it serves as a metabolic intermediates of your amino acid nucleotide synthesis. Next, the information storage or transfer of your DNA and RNA. And lastly, the cell-to-cell recognition or signaling surface specificity for the blood typing. Please do not forget these. Type A, type B, type AB, and type O, itong mga to. Okay, kung ano yung mga sugars ang present and absent, please do not forget. And then it serves as for the immunomodulation of the anticoagulant. Example natin dyan si heparin that has your glycoprotein. Next, this is the classification and nomenclature of your carbohydrates. It is subdivided into three: the monosaccharide, the oligosaccharide, and then polysaccharide. Okay, itong tatlo, meron pa siyang subdivision under or mga examples. So, i-discuss natin siya on our next slide. So, these are the major carbohydrate groups. Tatlo lang po sila, pakitandaan. Ito po, parang oligo to, oligo or disaccharide. Okay, monosaccharide, your oligo or disaccharide, and then your polysaccharide. This is termed as disaccharide lang kasi ang binigay na example natin on our right side, combination lang of two monosaccharides. So, si disaccharide, under po siya ni oligosaccharide. Pakitandaan po. Okay, oligosaccharide, under niya si disaccharide. But for this given example, nag-focus lang kay disaccharide. So, kung tatanungin, ano po yung major classification of your carbohydrates, tatlo lang sila: monosaccharide, oligosaccharide, and then your polysaccharide. So for your monosaccharide, these are the examples of your monosaccharide. We have your glucose. It is the main blood sugar. Next is the fructose, also known as your levulose. It can be found in the fruits. Your galactose in milk sugar, the deoxyribose. Okay, example niyan si DNA. And then ribose that can be found on your RNA. Next is the disaccharide, which is under the oligosaccharide. We have your sucrose, or what we call the table sugar. It is the combination of two monosaccharides, which is your glucose and then your fructose. Next example is your lactose that can be found on your milk sugar. It is the combination of your glucose and galactose. And lastly, your maltose. It is the product of the combination of a glucose plus glucose. Glucose plus glucose is equals to maltose. Next, let us now head on to the polysaccharide. The most familiar example of your polysaccharide are your glycogen. It is the stored form of your carbohydrates that is stored in your liver. Next is your starch and your cellulose. So ito can be found in the plants na po itong si cellulose. Okay? Let us further discuss the monosaccharide. Your monosaccharide cannot be hydrolyzed to simpler carbohydrate kasi siya na yung pinaka-basic form or simplest form. Therefore, it cannot be hydrolyzed into simpler form pa. Okay? And then it is classified according to whether it contains your aldehyde or your ketone group, and then classified according to the number of your carbon atoms. Okay? Pakitingin po sa ating example. Kaya po sila na nakaklassify under trioses, tetroses, pentroses, hexoses, and heptoses. Kasi depende po kung ilan yung carbon atoms nila sa kanilang structural formula. Okay po. And then your monosaccharide also includes the polyhydric alcohols in which the aldehyde group or ketone group has been reduced to an alcohol group for weight reduction and diabetics. So pakitandaan at pakikabisado po ang ating classification of monosaccharide. Next, these are the types and examples of your monosaccharide. When we say trioses. Ang mga example niya si glyceraldehyde, dihydroxyacetone, di ba? Ang importance niya on our biological function, it is the intermediates of your glycolysis and precursor of your glycerol. Next, your tetroses. Example niya si D-erythrose. It is the intermediate of carbohydrate metabolism. Next are your pentoses. Example niyan is yung D-ribose. It is the structural element of your nucleic acid, RNA, and coenzymes. Next is your D-glucose. It is the main sugar of the body. Please do take note. The D-fructose, it is converted to glucose and utilized by the body. Your D-galactose, synthesized in mammary gland to make the lactose milk. And lastly, the D-mannose, the constituent of your glycoprotein and your glycolipids. Next, let us now move forward to your oligosaccharide. It contains 2 to 10 monosaccharide units. Again, it contains 2 to 10 monosaccharide units and then it is joined together by your glycosidic bond. Ma'am, bakit parang familiar si glycosidic bond? Parang na-mention na natin siya before sa ating mga discussion. So, kung matatandaan ng inyong DNA composition or your RNA composition, meron kang phosphate group. Okay, kunwari maganda yung drawing ko and then merong nagbabond sa kanila sa iyong carbohydrate or your sugar. And then si sugar mo naman merong nagbabind or nagbabond sa kanila sa inyong nitrogenous bases. Ano pong tawag dito? Ang tawag natin dyan, glycosidic bond. Okay, so glycosidic bond, pwede din siyang term when we're joining 2 or more monosaccharides or 2 or more carbohydrates. Okay, so pag nag-join ka ng 2 carbohydrates, ng 2 monosaccharide, ang tawag po dyan, glycosidic bond din yan. So hindi lang po siya applicable from your sugar to nitrogenous bases. Pwede din siyang term when we say joining together of 2 or more monosaccharides. Ang tawag po sa kanila, glycosidic bond. And then it is subdivided based on the number of your monosaccharide units. It can be classified as disaccharide, trisaccharide, tetrasaccharide, and pentasaccharide. So ito, madali na lang siya kabisaduhin kasi when we say saccharide, it basically means sugar. So magkakatalo-talo na lang sa prefix. So dapat kabisado po natin yung prefix para hindi tayo malito. And then this is the classification of your oligosaccharides depending on the carbon atoms pa din po. Okay po, pakikabisado po yan. And then next is your polysaccharide. So kung ating oligosaccharide, 2 to 10 sugar units lang. Pag polysaccharide na, it contains more than 10 sugar units. Okay? It is also called your glycans. It can be in a linear or branched form. And please do take note, they do not exhibit any of the properties of aldehyde or your ketone group. Next, your polysaccharide has high molecular weight and sparingly soluble in cold water. So, mga example natin dyan, sina glycogen, sina starch, and then your cellulose. Next biomolecule are your lipids. Lipids means fats. Fats means lipids. And then your lipids are insoluble in water. Please do take note. And they are hydrophobic, meaning they fear the water or nire-repel nila yung water. Next, only the smallest lipids, some fatty acids, can dissolve in watery blood plasma. To become more soluble in blood plasma, other lipid molecules join with hydrophilic protein molecules. Please do take note. The resulting lipid protein complexes are termed lipoproteins. So, ma'am, bakit familiar si lipoprotein? So, kung may naka-experience na sa inyo ng lipid profile test, si mama tsaka si papa ninyo nakapagpa-lipid profile test, doon po pumapasok si lipoproteins. Okay, yung mga mini-measure natin doon na VLDL, HDL, LDL, yan, mga lipoproteins po sila. Kasi nga si ating lipids, they are hydrophobic in nature. Okay, they are insoluble in water. So to become more soluble and to become dissolved in our blood plasma, they needed to be combined with another molecule, which is your protein. So, nung nagkaroon na siya ng combination with protein, which is amphiteric naman siya, nagkaroon na ng hydrophilic characteristic, they resulted to a more complex biomolecule, which is termed as your lipoprotein. So, pwede na siyang i-measure sa ating blood plasma, okay? Or sa ating whole blood. Your lipoproteins are soluble because the proteins are on the outside and then the lipids are on the inside. Examples po natin are your fatty acids, your cholesterol, your triglycerides, phospholipids, eicosanoids, and many others. Your lipids or your fats basically functions as your cell structure. They create a barrier for the cell, controls the flow of the materials. Number 1 po yun. Number 2, function are your energy storage. Okay, your lipids or your fats are stored in the adipose or your several fat cells or your tissue. Ano po ba yung adipose natin? Yun yung ating mga fat cells. Okay, so yun lang naman ang adipose natin. And our old adipose, they can be found usually below our skin. Okay, yung adipose tissues natin or adipose cells. And then, madami po sila talaga sa ating abdomen part, lalo sa mga female. So, ang ating mga adipose usually has subcutaneous lang po yung mga yan. Okay, they can be found mostly under the skin. But, pagka masyado nang madami yung mga fats or lipids, pwede na po silang mahanap sa ating mga organs. O yun yung mga tinatawag natin mga visceral fats. Okay? Can be subdivided into subcutaneous fat and then the visceral fats. Okay? Kung naaalala nyo yung mga sinasabi yung mga tatay natin na mga malalaki yung tiyan, yung matitigas yung tiyan, di ba? Yun, napapalibutan na ng fats masyado yung kanilang mga organs. Hindi na din po maganda yun. Okay? And then your next, your lipids or your fats can function as vitamins because they assist in the regulation of the biological processes. Next. So, kung may magtatanong sa inyo, bakit ma'am ang pinapa-cut down or pinapa-lessen kapag gusto po namin mag-lose ng weight or mag-diet is i-lessen yung sugar intake? Okay? Bakit hindi po yung fats or yung mga lipid fatty food yung dapat namin i-cut down? Ang rationale po dyan is ang katawan natin, meron lang certain amount of or level ng sugar na kailangan para mag-function yung mga ating other cells, di ba? So lahat naman yan, yung mga biological functions, they needed the glucose to be converted into ATP para magtuloy-tuloy pa rin yung mga biological functions inside our body. But pagka nag-intake tayo ng too much sugar, napadami yung kain mo ng donut, napadami yung kain mo ng cake kasi merong only, it is then converted into fat and then nasustore siya sa ating mga adipose tissues. So remember, si glycogen, meron lang yung certain amount na kung saan yun lang yung ini-store niya, di ba, on the liver. So yung mga excess doon, hindi na kayang store ni glycogen yun sa liver and then na-convert na siya into fat. So yun yung mga observed natin na fat sa ating mga subcutaneous tissue. So sa ating mga balat, yun yung mga nakakapanyong fat. Na kasi sugar talaga siya, basically, na-convert lang siya into fat na nakastore sa inyong mga adipose tissue. So ating abdomen, tayo mga girls, madami po talaga tayong mga adipose tissues dyan naturally. So mas dyan nasustore yung ating mga fats. Next, your lipids or your fats functions as energy stored lipids in the form of triacylglycerol, in the membrane lipids as phospholipids, sphingoglycolipids, and cholesterol. And then the emulsification of lipids in the form of bile acids that is synthesized in the liver and stored in the gallbladder. The chemical messenger lipids, your steroid hormones, and then your eicosanoids. And lastly, the protective coating lipids or your biological waxes. Next, let us now head on to the specific functions of the lipids. It has 10. So number 1, si fatty acid. It is the metabolic fuel, building blocks of other lipids. And then your triglycerides, it is the main storage of your fatty acids and chemical energy. Please do take note. And then your phospholipids, component of the membrane, source of arachidonic acid, and then inositol triphosphate and your diglyceride for signal transduction. So itong si phospholipid, ito component ng ating cell membrane yan. Okay, yung ating mga transport, inner and outer transport, intracellular and extracellular happening inside our cell membrane. And then your sphingolipids, it is a component of the membrane. Your cholesterol, the components of your membrane, precursor of bile salts, and then your steroid hormones. Ano ba yung mga example ng steroid hormones natin? Sa na estrogens and na progesterone, example po yan ng ating mga steroid hormones. Next specific function are your bile salts, and then the lipid digestion and absorption, main product of your cholesterol metabolism, steroid hormones, intracellular signals that regulate gene expression in target cells, your eicosanoids, the regulators of your physiological function, your vitamins for the vision, calcium metabolism and antioxidants, and your blood coagulation, and then your ketone bodies for the metabolic fuel. So kung matatandaan, na-mention natin sa ating module 1, ang main form of energy na ginagamit talaga ng ating katawan ang ating mga carbohydrates. But in the situation na kung saan naubos ang ating mga stored sugar or stored carbohydrates, ang next na gagamitan ng ating katawan or ang next source for the energy or for the function of the body are your lipids or your fats. So yung byproduct nun, yung ating mga ketone bodies. Next, what are fatty acids? A fatty acid has a carboxyl group at the polar end or your head and a hydrocarbon chain at the non-polar tip. Fatty acids are amphipathic, meaning they possess both polar and non-polar group compounds because the carboxyl group is hydrophilic and then the hydrocarbon tail is hydrophobic. Okay, pakitandaan. And most of the fatty acids found in nature have an even number of carbon atoms, usually 14 to 24 po yan. Next, your fatty acids, kapag merong carbon-to-carbon double bonds in the chain, the fatty acid is called unsaturated. Okay, pakitandaan, pag may carbon-to-carbon bond, double bond, unsaturated po yan. If there are only single bond, the fatty acid is saturated. Ano po yung sinasabi niya, ma'am? Tignan po natin sa ating chemical structure. Okay, pansinin ang chemical structure ni saturated fat. Saturated fat, single bonds lang po yung mga carbon atoms. Pansinin. Okay. Yung unsaturated po natin, meron po tayong napansin na double bond. Okay, your saturated fats, the bonds between all the carbons are single bonds. And then they are solid at room temperature. Pakitandaan, solid at room temperature and mainly animal fats. Example nun, mga bacon, grease, and then the lard. Okay? Ang unsaturated fats naman natin, there are at least one or double or triple bond between the carbons present on your chemical structure. Usually, they are liquid at room temperature. Ano ba yung mga yon? They are mainly plant-based fats. Example, olive oil, peanut oil, as well as your oily fish, your tuna, and then your sardines. Next, your triacylglycerol, or what we call the triglycerides. Glycerol is a simple compound that contains 3 hydroxyl groups. When all 3 alcohol groups form ester linkages with fatty acids, the resulting compound is a triacylglycerol. An older name for this type of compound is triglyceride. Pakitandaan. And then these are the properties of your triglyceride. In the physical state, your fat, a mixture of triglyceride containing a high portion of long-chain saturated fatty acid. And then kapag ka-oil naman siya, it is a mixture of triglyceride containing a high portion of long-chain unsaturated fatty acid or short-chain saturated fatty acid. Next, the physical properties of your triglyceride depend on the fatty acid component. The melting points of your fatty acid increases as the number of carbons in the hydrocarbon chains increases and as the number of the double bonds decreases. And then the triglycerides rich in unsaturated fatty acids are generally liquid at room temperature and are called as oils. Okay, ulit-ulit lang. And then the triglyceride rich in saturated fatty acid are generally semi-solid or solid at room temperature and are called as fats. Okay, so kung natatandaan nyo yung mga palabas na mga hell kitchen ba yun? Yung Gordon, di ba? May mga lard na ginagamit doon. They are formed of fats. Next, the simple and complex lipids. It is subdivided into simple and then the complex. Kapag ka simple, basically glycerol with 3 fatty acids. Okay, parang building blocks lang, monomer lang. Kapag ka complex lipids, it is subdivided into phospholipids and glycolipids. And then your phospholipids, it contains a platform molecule, one or more fatty acid, a phosphate group, and then your alcohol component. Okay, dapat ang phospholipid meron po siyang ganitong component. And then the fatty acid gives the phospholipid hydrophobic properties, while the phosphate and the alcohol group give its hydrophilic properties. Again, the fatty acid gives the phospholipid hydrophobic property, while the phosphate and alcohol group gives its hydrophilic properties. Okay? Kasi si fatty acid, fats in nature, hydrophobic po talaga sila. So, what makes your phospholipid suitable for the cell membrane? Meron kasi siyang phosphate and alcohol group. So, that makes it hydrophilic. Thus, phospholipids are amphipathic. Pag sinabi nating amphipathic, meron siyang hydrophilic and hydrophobic characteristic. Okay? Or pwede siyang polar and non-polar. Parang ganon. Okay? So, meron siyang 2 characteristic. Next biomolecule is your nucleic acid. Your deoxyribonucleic acid, it has a nitrogenous base. Ito po. The DNA contains 4 different nitrogenous bases which contains atoms of C, H, O, and N. In DNA, the 4 nitrogenous bases are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and then your guanine. Next, for the pentose sugar, okay, monosaccharide po yan. It is a 5-carbon sugar. Kaya siya naging pentose kasi 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, meron kang 5 carbon atoms. And then it is attached into the base of the DNA. And lastly, your phosphate group. Okay, it is alternate with the pentose sugar to form the backbone of a DNA strand. And then the bases project inward from the backbone chain. Next biomolecule are your proteins. It comes from the Greek word proteus, meaning first rank of importance. Your proteins function as biological catalyst or enzymes. Tulad nga po ng sinabi natin, di ba? Enzymes are types of your proteins, transporters of oxygens and hormones. And then the chemical composition or structure of your proteins, they basically contains carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And what are the building blocks of your proteins? That will be your amino acids. Next, and then it is attached to one another by your peptide bond. Ano pong tawag doon sa mga nag-a-attach or nag-join sa ating mga amino acids? Ang tawag po doon, peptide bond. Please do not forget. And then your proteins are amphoteric in nature, meaning they can be positive or negative in charge. Okay, yung charges ng protein nyo, meron po siyang positive and negative charge, and they can react with both acid or base. Okay? Kung tatandaan, titignan po natin ang ating chemical structure. What binds your structure? Ang tawag po doon, peptide bond. What makes your protein amphoteric? Kasi ang amino group po ng ating protein, ang amino group, pakitandaan. So, kunwari, may protein ka dyan. Yung amino group mo, ito yun, yung amino, di pala kasama to. Yung amino group mo dyan, okay, they have positive charge. And then the carboxyl group, meron po siyang negative charge. So your proteins are amphoteric. So going back doon sa sinabi nating amphipathic, yung phospholipid, kasi yung hydrophobic property, nakuha ni phospholipid yun from the fatty acid. But the hydrophilic property or characteristic, nakuha niya sa phosphate and alcohol group. Okay, so kung mababasa niyo amphoteric, amphipathic, meaning they contain both of the characteristic. So going back to our protein, please do not forget the proteins are amphoteric, meaning they can have positive or negative in charge and they can react with both acid and bases. Next, your isomers or and isomerism, in organic chemistry, we come across some of the compounds which have similar number of atoms but differ in physical and chemical properties and are called isomers. And the phenomenon is called isomerism. Isomers have same molecular formula but different in arrangement of atoms within a molecule. Next, amino acid. Please do take note of the structure. The primary structure of amino acid has alpha carbon. Meron pong alpha carbon yan. Okay? With 4 configuration of binding sites or coordination points. Ano po ba yung mga yon? Number 1, meron kang amino group. Okay, ang amino acid, laging may amino group yan. And then protonated at the physiologic pH of your 7.4, may carboxyl group ka dyan. Okay, ito po yun. Diba? Positive yung charge ng ating amino group, negative yung charge ng ating carboxyl group. Ito po yun. And then may hydrogen atom. Okay, may hydrogen atom. And then yung functional group na R or yung side chain. Dito po nagkakaroon ng differentiation between the amino acids. Okay, na-mention natin meron tayong 20 amino acids. Yes, they all contain amino group, the acid group or your carboxyl group, but they differ in the side chain or your R group. Okay, kasi nga, unique siya in each amino acids and denotes the chemistry. Okay, pakitandaan si glycine. Glycine po, glycine is the only amino acid with another hydrogen atom as its side chain. Okay, glycine lang po ang only amino acid with another hydrogen atom as its side chain. Please do take note. Next, what is your Zwitter ion formation? Madami po siyang sinabi about Zwitter ion formation, but basically ito lang siya. Zwitter ion is the presence of both acid and a base in the same molecule leads to an interaction between the two. This interaction results in a transfer of hydrogen ion from an acid portion of the base of the molecule. An amino acid with both positive and negative region is called Zwitter ion. Ang tatandaan lang po sa Zwitter ion formation is itong naka-highlight. Excuse me. The net charge of the Zwitter ion is 0. Meron kasi siyang chemistry behind on paano nangyari sa Zwitter ion. But basically, Zwitter ion meaning hybrid. Hybrid siya. Parang French word siya or German word meaning hybrid. Okay? But basically, it means that the Zwitter ion formation is the net charge of the Zwitter ion containing 0 charge. So, meron siyang formula on how to get this. Ito, di ba? Yung ating isoelectric point. Okay, kukunin natin yung PK, average PK, the dissociation constant, may mga ganun pa siya. Pero hindi na po natin siya i-discuss much further. Hindi na tayo magdudwell doon kasi hindi naman siya masyadong kailangan. Oo, essential siya, but in a way na hindi na po natin siya i-discuss much further. Hindi naman siya masyadong kailangan sa ating biochemistry. Okay, ang tatandaan lang for our amino acids, Zwitter ion form is, ang ibig sabihin niya, meron siyang hybrid. Okay, it contains the positive and then the negative charge. And meron siyang 0 net charge. And then ito lang yung tatandaan nyo, Zwitter ion, the meaning, and then the isoelectric point. Okay? For the formula, hindi na tayo magdudwell on dyan masyado. Next are the 20 protein amino acids. So like what we've mentioned, we have 20 different types of your amino acids. Then it is subdivided into as essential and non-essential amino acids. So for the non-essential amino acids, wala naman pong problema because they can be synthesized naturally by our body. But for the essential amino acids, these are the type of amino acids that cannot be synthesized naturally by our body. Meaning, it must be found on our diet or doon sa ating food intake. Okay, ito pong mga essential amino acids na to. And then, para hindi tayo malito, meron tayong nakitang mnemonics for the essential amino acids. It is what we call the PVT team hall. PVT team hall, the phenylalanine, the valine, the tryptophan, the threonine, the isoleucine, methionine, histidine, arginine, lysine, and uracil. Ito yung mga ating essential amino acid. Next is the primary protein structure sequence of amino acids. Ito yung 20 different types and codes lang nila para hindi tayo malito. And then amino acids are subdivided into 4 subgroups based on the nature of the side chain, groups attached to the alpha carbon, and the general behavior of the amino acid. So kung babalikan lang natin yung ating amino acid structure, meron po tayong structure dito. Tandaan, may amino group, meron tayong carboxyl group, meron tayong side chain, and then the alpha carbon. Okay, yung side chain natin, ang sabi nga natin kay glycine, pag yung side chain natin, example, hindi siya R. Example, H lang siya. So, makita mo pa lang yung chemical structure na yun, alam mo na agad na glycine siya. Okay, so ito, kuwari, burahin natin itong side chain. Ito kasi lahat sila, constant sila for each amino acid. So, ang sabi nga po natin, nagdi-differ lang sila when it comes to the side chain. But pag nakita mo dito na H lang siya, hydrogen, automatic glycine kagad yun. Okay? Kasi nga, glycine is the only amino acid with another hydrogen atom as its side chain. Going back, we have general 4 behavior of your amino acid. Your non-polar, your polar, acidic, and basic. So, anong difference nilang apat? The non-polar, hydrophobic amino acids. Meron tayong example, sila alanine, valine, leucine, isoleucine, proline, methionine, phenylalanine, and tryptophan. So, hindi pala sila 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 po sila. For the polar and uncharged hydrophilic amino acids, we have, aside from uncharged amino acids, other than the glycine, that can hydrogen bond to the water. For this reason, they usually more soluble than the non-polar amino acids. The amino acids in this group are your glycine, serine, asparagine, glutamine, threonine, tyrosine, and your cysteine. Next is your acidic amino acid. These are this aspartic and glutamic acid. In both of these amino acid, the side group contains carboxylic acidic group. This secondary carboxylic acid group is weaker acid than the primary acid group. Please do take note. And lastly, the basic amino acid. The basic amino acids, tatlo lang sila. Madaling tandaan, lalo yung naka-blue na highlight sa dulo. Si histidine, arginine, and lysine. All of these are classified as basic amino acid, but dramatic changes in pH can affect their reactivities, especially true sa ating histidine. Okay, essential amino acid tong si ating lysine, di ba, kung tatandaan? And then for the proteins and enzymes, please do take note, this will be discussed on the part 2 of our discussion. And reminder lang, please keep the laboratory identification of amino acids and proteins part on your module, as this will be discussed in our laboratory part. Okay?